All right, everyone, welcome. It is exactly actually 2:01 Central Time. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. Listen, we have a really jam-packed uh, agenda today. And I'm a little nervous about us being able to get through it. But what was interesting is that as you all were registering, we really do tailor these sessions based on what you say you need. And you all said a lot in your registration. And so I first want to thank all of you for being here. I have some special guests who are joining me today, so I'm super excited about that. I want to take maybe just 20 more seconds to respond to the poll. And I want to make sure that my panelists have their video and audio. I see Larissa, I see Rich, I see Pronica, I see Dustin, and Stephanie is off video, but Stephanie will be helping us. She's just helping me with the chat and the Q&A. But this is my crew for today, and I'm really excited to have all of them, as I am to have all of you here. So we'll take a few more moments to respond to the poll question. So what was interesting is that many of you, this is your first time. So I love to see how many first timers we have. So if this is your first time, could you just put it in chat? Just put first time, your name will show up obviously when you're in chat. I mentioned this earlier, but if you're just joining, this is a very interactive session. And so I'm gonna ask you to use chat. I'm gonna ask you to use the Q&A. I'm gonna ask you to respond to the poll questions. And then later on in this session, you'll even have the opportunity to get even more interactive and really participate in a bold, brave way. So I'd love to see, it looks like a lot of people, this is their first time. So for those of you, this is your first time, just know that this is our fifth Bold X Brave session, I believe. And so we started doing this back in June. And I'm always excited. There's always a new audience. There's always a new feel anytime we do these sessions. And so in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on and make sure that we get started. All right, so today's Bold X Brave is an interactive webinar addressing corporate racism. And specifically, we're looking at workplace equity. That is our focus for today. That is our focus for this series and really for the work that we do at CTM Unlimited. I'm gonna go really fast through the introduction, and I promise you I'll sprinkle in some things about what our business does, as well as some of the things that have been happening this year as we go through this session. But again, we have a lot to do in a little bit of time, so I really wanna get started. So before we go any further, we do have some goals and agreements for these sessions. And this is how we start every single session that we do. And so our goals and agreements are the following. We will tell the truth even if it is uncomfortable or inconvenient. This is also a safe space for open, bold, brave dialogue. Engagement is key, which I mentioned that already, to make sure that everyone is aware that in order for you to get the best value out of this, you must be engaged. We also are going to respect our colleagues. So if people are talking on camera, whether it's our special guests that I've explicitly invited, or some of you who decide to participate by camera or by audio, we don't want to do any public attributions without permission. So what that means is that if someone says something, if they share a story, it could be something that's sensitive. And so we want to make sure that before we quote them on LinkedIn or anything like that, we just get their permission. And we want to honor everyone who is bold and brave enough to speak out, to ask questions, even if we don't agree with them. And then finally, we're going to respect all genuine participation. So that's questions, comments, even if it feels a little bit uncomfortable. So if you could just indulge me and put "I agree" in the chat, just because, I mean, obviously it's not legally binding or anything like that, but then I feel a little bit better about the fact that everyone is on the same page and we all have these agreements. So I see people popping from chat saying that they agree. Just really quickly, Stephanie Trevino is actually monitoring chat and Q&A for me. And so we'll get into some of the content and also some of the ways that you're going to engage. But if you have a question, you can actually direct it directly to Stephanie, and she'll bring it to my attention in the event that I don't see it. So let's talk about how we got here. So first of all, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Janae Johnson, and I'm the CEO of CTM Unlimited. And our company is really focused around workplace equity and helping leaders achieve that. But even more importantly, we are focused around flipping the tables on traditional D&I. We have looked at the research, we've looked at the data, and we understand that the ROI on traditional diversity programs really is not what it needs to be based on the amount of money and time and resources that have been invested over the last 20 years. So we really lean on proven behavior change methodologies to help leaders actually accomplish their DEI goals. But that's not actually how we got here. We got here because there was a Black man named George Floyd who was murdered at the end of May of this year. And it sparked this social unrest and also a corporate reckoning, which I think we're all familiar with. And to be honest with you, I was not okay. And I was showing up to very professional meetings, corporate meetings, meeting with colleagues and clients, and I wasn't okay. And I was really falling apart in those meetings. My Black friends, family, colleagues, they were not okay. And so I kept searching for a safe space to have this conversation about not being okay, about the symbolism of the killing of George Floyd, and how it just wasn't about a Black man who looked like my husband, my sons, my father, my brother, but it was also about the symbolism of feeling like you're showing up at work and you can't breathe. And so I was triggered by all of it for so many reasons and on so many layers. So I was looking for this place like, hey, where can we talk about this? Where can we figure out some real solutions? And I couldn't find one, so I created it. And so Bold X Brave actually started out as just a raw public conversation. We shared it on LinkedIn. We just sent it to people that we knew and said, hey, if you want to talk about this, let's talk about it. But now looking ahead to 2021, we're really focused on taking what we've learned from these sessions. And now we've been able to offer it to clients, help clients with facilitating similar sessions, but also turning it into a set of tools for leaders. And now in 2021, we're focused on implementation, measurement, and results, which you'll hear more about. And it is why I have intentionally invited the guests that are here with me today. So let's talk about the 3 forms of Bold X Brave engagement. So for those of you, if it is your first time, I will warn you, this may be a little bit startling because right now you probably just see some words on the screen, you're hearing from me, and you see some of my special guests who are joining us today. But what's going to happen is if you are bold and brave enough, you could be one of those special guests if you raise your hand. And so the way we do Bold X Brave, we start out with an agenda. We start out with very clear objectives, but then we open it up to the audience. And so if you are bold and brave enough, if you have a question, if you want to just share a comment, then I ask you and I encourage you to just raise your little virtual hand. So at the bottom of your screen, there should be a button that says raise my hand. And if your hand is raised, when it's time for us to open this up for discussion, you too will be on video and on audio. And so I don't know how many people are going to raise their hand. We never know. That's the thing. It could be 12 people, it could be 20, it could be 5. We have no idea. So if you are bold and brave enough, when we get to that point, and if you already know, like, yes, I'm one of those people, which I see some people in our participant list who have been with us before, who are sort of our OGs, and they often raise their hand to talk on camera. But I encourage you to do that. I encourage everyone to use the Q&A. So if you have questions specific to your organization, please make sure that you use the Q&A. The cool thing about the Q&A is that I can answer your questions, our panelists can answer your questions, but you all can answer each other's questions as well. And so in our previous sessions, it's something that we do often, and a lot of times we end up crowdsourcing solutions. So I see somebody has already raised their hand, which is so exciting. And so we'll take note, just keep your hand up. When we get to that segment, we will move you over to be a panelist. So here's the thing. These are some of the things that we're going to talk about today. And I think, you know, if you saw any of my LinkedIn posts about this session, if you saw what was in the registration, you know that this is not necessarily a safe and polite conversation. It's safe because we are honoring each other's differences and we're also all focused on a common goal, but it's not necessarily polite. Okay, so we're going to say words like racism. We're going to say words like systemic racism. We're going to use Black and white. We're not going to tiptoe around the actual issues. But we are all focused on actually looking for solutions. And how do we really change this systemic issue? So if you see some of the things that are on the screen, these are some of the themes and topics that not only am I talking about, but this is why I specifically handpicked the people who are our special guests today. So I love this idea around belonging, but a lot of times companies are kind of confused, like, how do we go about doing that? And how do we actually measure it? So I have a special guest here today who's going to talk about that. I have someone here who's going to talk about what it's like to be Black in a corporate space and to have your leaders lean on you and ask you, you know, what do we do? How can we help? And how not only is that exhausting, but you're also in a position where you do have ability to influence change, but you have to be very strategic about what you say and what your response is. So I have a guest here for that. And then I'm not going to list everything or name everything that's on the screen, but it's really important just for you all to know that these are the themes. And so if you have additional questions or if there are other things that you're interested in, that's when we get to the open discussion that you can pose those questions, but you can also pose those questions in the Q&A. So I have talked enough. It's time for a poll question. And this is very simple. If you've already joined the poll, it's just true or false. Keep in mind, there are two ways to join the poll. You can do it on your browser. And so that's a browser on your phone or on your desktop, or you can text in your response. And so the question is, my leaders and organization have clearly defined racial equity goals. True or false? And we're going to leave that up for a moment. And it looks like we're at about 75-25. Okay. All right. Vast majority say false, like vast majority. We'll leave it open for just a couple more seconds. Now, if you know anything about me, you know that I ask questions on intention. And so that question is an excellent segue to our first guest spotlight. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. If you have other commentary about this question, or maybe you say, well, it's not really true or false, or you have some, an other response, please feel free to add it in the chat. But for now, we're going to go ahead and move on, and I'm going to introduce our first special guest. So our first special guest is Larissa Thomas, and she is the SVP of Organizational Effectiveness and Change Management at Wells Fargo. She's also an authentic change leader, an executive game changer, and is extremely passionate, not just about being a servant leader, but helping businesses see results. I've known Larissa for several years. I've seen her work. I've worked alongside her, and I know how important this work is. And I know about just her pure focus on helping cultures change and her appreciation for how difficult that is. So without any further ado, I'm going to go to Larissa. And Larissa, I'm actually going to stop sharing because I want everybody to see you and to see us as we talk. So I'm going to, and you all will get used to this. I'll go from share to no share. So please, if this is too much for you, I understand, but just know we're going to kind of move around in this webinar. So Larissa, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. And for those of you who are listening, the way that we're doing our guest spotlights, I have specific questions for each one of them based on what I know they're working on in their organizations. But also, they're going to talk in general later on, and you all will have an opportunity to join them as well. So Larissa, could you first tell us a little bit about this concept of racial equity? So you saw the poll results. You saw how people are feeling about what's happening in their organizations. Can you tell us more about your role in helping to define that at Wells Fargo?
Sure. So racial equity varies by organization. So one, it's the concept of equity is everybody's responsibility, but racial equity within your organization has to be defined by the leadership. For me right now, I think a lot of companies are missing the mark, and why that poll resulted in that number is because everybody is taking a peanut butter approach to equity. Equity has to be what your culture can deliver. And if your culture is biased or doesn't have programs or inclusion or belonging as a part of how it behaves every day, equity is harder to achieve. So for us inside, and I'm in an industry that is slow to change. So equity is new in financial services. And I'm saying new like the last 2 years in financial services. While it has been inclusive and growing in its diversity, the equity, which has to do with power, is new. So for me, it's helping my own organization define what we can achieve and what we can sustain in that equity.
So, Larissa, I want you to tell me a little bit more about how you're helping this organization navigate through something that is extremely new, and that obviously it's not just financial services industry, it's not just Wells Fargo. There's a lack of understanding, right? And maybe there's a lack of how to define it. So what would you tell companies, or what would you tell other people who are struggling with the same thing? Like, hey, this is new to us, or we don't really understand what this means, or hey, we're not even sure how to set goals and metrics around this in terms of understanding when we achieve it. So what would you say to them?
I would ask each CEO or leader that's committing to it, what will you keep up without being required to? So if no one checks on you, will you still do it? If you don't have to publish a report to your stakeholders, to your shareholders, would you still do it? That's equity. Equity is when you behave that way just because it's what you do, it's how you think. No one has to remind me to check on someone. I do it because it's inherent in how I think. Equity is the same way. If you see an interview panel or you see your leadership team growing and you don't naturally ask, why don't I have more women or more people of color? Naturally, without your HR business partner or someone having to remind you, then equity is not at the top of your mind. So as I talk to leaders, it has to become a part of how you behave and how you lead. And that leads me into helping them discuss their own biases because, inequity has to do with your familiarity and comfort.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So as a senior leader that may be Caucasian, you're familiar with not looking around a room that doesn't look like you. Equity has to do with you deciding to keep that top of mind on your agenda, to change that without somebody reminding you because your D&I metric is tanking that you should.
Whew. Larissa, look, I warned everybody, we are telling the truth
Yeah.
today. So, and we're not going to dance around it. And I think what I got from a lot of your commentary is this notion that one, we know what doesn't get, if it doesn't get measured, it doesn't get done. That's number one. And then secondly, it's about that accountability piece. Like, hey, would you still do this? So would you still do it if no one was looking, if no one was checking, if no one was holding you accountable? And how do you embed that into your daily behaviors? Because it's not, for the example you gave, it's not like someone has to tell you every day, hey, I need to check on people. It's just something that you do. It's a part of your daily routine. It's almost mindless in the way that you do it.
And for most companies that haven't mastered this, what I will tell you is they have to change their hiring strategy. You have to hire inclusive leaders and you have to let go of those that are not. Inclusive leaders operate, I hire to diversity of thought, to credible challenge, which for me on my team that I manage, it created a diverse team. Everybody doesn't look like Larissa, and there's a mix because I'm hiring smarter than me, more challenging people that are more innovative. So you have to be an inclusive leader in order to make diversity how you behave. If you're not an inclusive leader, you don't intend to have your business thrive forever. Inclusive leaders hire different because they want to innovate. They want to tap into different cultures, into different dynamics and mindsets. And it's all about progress. Inclusive leaders operate with the different, the differentiator, the game changer. If you hire like you, then you're not trying to innovate or be different. You're trying to keep the power in the status quo. And as we've seen this year, that's no longer sustainable. So we'll just sit back and watch you go out of business.
So Larissa, you said the S word, that's sustainability, which when we look at just sort of the business case around diversity, equity, inclusion, there is a clear business case. It's not just about it being the right thing to do. So
Mhm.
you can look at the projections of talent pipelines and see that not only will you not remain competitive if you don't change, but also you may lose out on the IP that you do have, because what's happening is people are saying, you know what, I don't want to work here anymore.
Right.
I don't want to tolerate this. So, Larissa, to that point, there have been some very public things that have happened with Wells Fargo this year. Well, not just this year, but definitely this year
Mhm.
related to this topic. And so the first one that I wanted to mention is about that lack of retention. So, for those of you who don't know, there was an article about Wells Fargo in that they lost 7 Black female executives in 1 year, and they lost them to other financial services companies. Same industry, but they went elsewhere.
And higher levels.
Yes. So, Larissa, I want you to first just comment on the impact that that had on you, seeing that happen from the inside. And then, secondly, what does that say about the leadership, not just at Wells Fargo, but in the industry? Like, what were the lessons learned from that?
Sure. So personally, for me, I can't speak for my org, but for me personally, it crystallized what I was already feeling about the level of respect and value or perceived value of African American women in financial services. Um, it concerned me because I was like, gosh, that's everybody that looks like me. They left.
Mm-hmm.
And more importantly, the perception or feeling of the door was held open. So nobody is blocking the door like, wait, hold on, what just happened? It didn't feel like that. And the thing is all of the individuals that were in that article, I believe my perception is that there were enough warning signs, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
had the I have a cold, I have a cough. You had all the triggers that said something was going wrong. Um, it made me start to ask myself if courage wise, women and people of color have become complacent or we're fatigued, not complacent. We've grown fatigued of asking and pushing and saying something because we're numb as well. It's like they don't care.
Mm-hmm.
Then it made me really push and go. I was happy to see the 7 women exit because they voted with their feet, and it was very public, and it was very timely. That it was like, wow, you ignored this, and it required our organization to take a deeper look, which they're doing. But holistically, when I come back around to how it happens in an industry, I ask myself if the leaders that were in control or had power to make it stop were inclusive to begin with. I think there's this, we're not talking about this very fundamental thing that women of color are replaceable.
Mm-hmm.
There's no, you know, no one's
Say,
concerned with
say,
the
say that again. So,
women of color. There's this
yes.
perception that women of color are replaceable because we're not respected. It's you can get another black woman.
Right. Dime a dozen.
Mhm. No one is worried about the exit of a minority population, and it's because everybody just thinks, well, no one cares if they retain us. So you have to get to
Mhm.
the data of it all and the mindset and the pathology of the leader. This is a pathology of the leader that isn't concerned. So
Yeah.
you have to go there. This is not just a what was wrong in your recruiting, what was wrong in your retention or development plan. It was how did those individuals leaders miss it? Because their emotion, their disdain, their disengagement, their lack of courage, their lack of innovation, it started to show up. It didn't. This wasn't like 3 months and they all left. It was over time. It
Mm-hmm.
was over conversation. It was over mispromotion. It was over stretch assignment for you, flat merit. It was over this person came from the outside and got a role that I've been doing for 10 years. It wasn't like that. It was over time. And it was,
Yeah.
you go back to the leaders going, how did you miss it?
So Larissa, first of all, there are people who are blowing up chat about your comments. Like they're quoting you. There's a lot of yes and yes, yes, and yes with a bunch of S's. So just know that the commentary in this conversation is resonating. And I think it's also raising some awareness because if you're not a Black woman working in a corporate space, you may not understand that perspective, right? And then even beyond that, we have leaders on this call today who are really looking for solutions. And so what you're sharing is helping them to start getting some ideas around what can happen or what's possible for their organization. So Larissa, I have one more question and we got to do like rapid fire because I
Yeah.
got other guests and we got other stuff to do. But here is my question.
Yes.
So what do you do when you are that Black employee? You're that Black senior leader. So you're in this role, you're in this position, and your leadership is coming to you saying, hey, what can we do? And mind you, you may be traumatized and you may be exhausted and you may not want to answer that question, right? That might be too much for you. And
Yeah.
so I know I got that question a lot. I got it from colleagues, I got it from clients, I got it from people that I know, from friends. And there is an opportunity to influence change. But how do you really process that? And
Good.
how do you, as a Black professional, actually capitalize on that moment to really, see some real change in the organization?
Sure. So first, I would tell you commit to the courage that's required to say something. Um, right, wrong, or indifferent. If you're a woman of color, a person of color, you don't get to opt out anymore. You have to think back to what our ancestors did in civil rights time and find a girlfriend, lock arm, tell her hold your back. But I'm about to say something. You have to
Yeah.
commit to the courage. That's the first thing. The second thing I would tell any person of color that has the opportunity with a C-suite to help them change how they operate is to put your emotion on the shelf, because this
Ooh,
is about
tough.
business. This is about business. Put your emotions on the shelf. I don't need them to cry with me. I don't need them to understand what it's like to get my hair done, what it's like for getting pulled over or racially profiled, because the reality is their privilege, those of them that are, has afforded them the ability to opt out of that. So I don't need to help educate you on that. What I need you to do is show me what you need from a return on investment. And I want to talk to you about how the culture of people that are historically disenfranchised and tenacious and made it out of slavery can help you, because the country has tried to get rid of us. We're not going anywhere. So why don't you let me help you make your business more profitable? Put your emotion on the shelf and get down to business and facts.
Mm. Okay, so listen, I hope you all are taking notes. I mean, I'm glad this is being recorded so I can go back and listen. So before we go on to our next guest spotlight, first of all, Larissa, thank you for your comments. Larissa is going to be around for the whole session. So later on, if you want to jump in and just get into some dialogue with Larissa, she will be here. Stephanie, I want to go to the Q&A. Do we have any questions in Q&A, and do we have any comments or questions in chat?
So what we have is a question about equality and the definition. So the question was, I thought equity means people may need different treatment to make their opportunities the same as others, needing equity to achieve equality. Is that correct, or is it being used more broadly?
Good question. And interestingly enough, we have a slide for that. So that was a good segue, not planned, but I can share something about that before we go on to our next person. So if you look here, and these are actually, we're doing a few flashbacks of some of the work that we've done this year. So I'll talk a little bit about the graph that's on the left in a moment. But hopefully everyone can see this idea around equity versus equality, because it comes up in conversation with our clients all the time. And it is a matter of awareness. It is a matter of like, how can we be more aware of what this means? And more importantly, how do we know when we've achieved it in our organization? So how do you set real goals around something that feels very abstract? And so in a minute, our next guest is going to talk about data and analytics around diversity, equity, and inclusion. But if you look at this cactus and then you look at these seeds with kind of the dirt, it's a very rudimentary and simple illustration, but it's impactful. And so if you think about, these are both plants technically. But if you think about the needs of the cactus and the needs of this dirt with the little seedling, completely different needs. Both plants, but different needs. And to actually see full maturity, they have different needs and they're at different stages. So if this cactus is actually, maybe that's as big as it's going to grow, or maybe it has, I don't know, 6 months left of growth. But for this seedling, there's a lot to go to actually achieve it. And so sometimes we have to think about equity, first of all, in the sense that there is no statistical indicator that says what the future of an employee is going to be based on their race, based on their gender, based on their physical ability, based on their sexual orientation. So, what that means is that if I were to look at an organization right now and I were to pick out a Black woman, statistically, I could predict how far she's going to go in that organization. Statistically, I could predict how long she's going to stay with that organization based on the fact that the data shows that Black women maybe have less longevity in the organization. And so when we achieve equity, it means that literally I can take a white man, a Black woman, an Asian woman, a Hispanic man, and everyone has the exact same probability of achieving the exact same things in that organization. So we can go back to, when we open it up, we can go back to this discussion on equity and equality. I do want to go on to our next guest. So our next guest is Richard Harden. Richard is the lead data consultant at Project Analytics, but Rich is also at CTM Unlimited. He is our go-to data SME. And so when I have questions, need guidance, need strategy around what to do with our clients in terms of how we collect data and what data is important, Rich is my go-to. So Rich, he has a detailed background, an extensive background, over 15 years of experience, really being a thought leader in data and analytics. And so, Rich, I want to talk to you about this notion of what companies need to be thinking about, because again, what we said before, what gets measured gets done. And so a lot of times when, if we think about traditional D&I, we talk about training and leadership development, and those things are important, but how do we actually know that we're getting results? And what are some of those data considerations that companies need to think about as they start leading this effort?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First off, Larissa, so powerful,
Right.
so powerful. I'll piggyback off of what she said. What doesn't get measured doesn't get done. That kind of just sums it up right there. How do you know there's a problem if the question is not asked?
Yeah.
Well, you know that there's a problem. How do you find a solution if you don't measure it? You either measure it or, pardon me, you choose to ignore it. And it is when you choose to ignore it that you lose valuable assets, much like the illustration that was given in the first segment.
So Rich, tell me more about what exactly should be measured. So, when we're looking at, setting up things for our clients and thinking about, okay, in order to actually achieve results, we have these different things. But let's say it's a company that says, hey, you know what, I have limited resources, I have limited budget, we don't have a dedicated data analyst, we don't have all of the fancy tools to run all these queries to pull everything together. We haven't done an enterprise-wide survey like this, of this kind, or maybe we have limited leadership support for this. What would you say to them? What could they do where they still could achieve some results and be able to get something that is measurable to look for their long-term solutions?
Thank you for queuing me up for this, but I will tell them, and I told you this earlier, shenanigans.
Yeah.
Pure shenanigans. This is 2020, where businesses have been forced to go outside of the box, where people have been forced to leave the office building and rethink the way they do things at home. So let's take, for instance, your standard accountant, right? When your standard accountant doesn't have access to their fancy ERP system to enter their numbers, but they still have to record things, what do they put it in? Excel.
Excel.
The question that was entered at the beginning of this call, in terms of a survey, and so in terms of a simple true or false, you can pull that data down and you can put it into what? Excel.
Mm-hmm.
The standard equivalent for, and pardon me if this gets too technical, but the standard equivalent for the layman's database is Excel. I would venture to ask, how much effort does it take for a single person, just a single person, to sit and think of, what questions would I like to be asked at work when it comes to equality? I'm pretty sure everyone on this call can think of at least 2 off the top of their head. Now, if your leadership, and going back to Larissa's point, if your leadership has this, what I will call culture,
Mm-hmm.
to form a committee of two persons, and get said feedback, which would take all of, we'll say, an hour. We'll be generous and say an hour. So, because as Larissa said, this is business, right? So we're going to count their hours in terms of, what are we losing? So 1 hour. They take the particular questions and they can form them into a brief survey. Now, surveys are done via email, via SurveyMonkey. I tell you what, it's the end of the year, right? How many people on this call have already done their compliance surveys or their compliance trainings? Cybersecurity, workplace violence, sexual harassment,
Yep.
ethics, code of conduct. What stops your leadership from making a quick survey that's 10 questions long that takes you less time to do that than to do an actual compliance, or make it a part of your compliance? How about that? So we've identified a free solution. So that throws money out the window. We've identified a way to gather the data and streamline it. So the basic accountant or HR representative can gather the responses. And if you don't have a fancy system, well, Excel's good at making graphs. So again, we've thrown that out the window. And so it becomes a matter of not if it can be done, but do you want it to be done?
Yeah. Say
And
that.
that is where the change of thought, the change of mind, and the change of culture then comes to place. So again, when someone says we don't have the resources, we don't have the time, we don't have the personnel, I say shenanigans, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
being polite.
You are being polite. You're definitely being polite, but I hope everyone caught that. So what Rich just did, he just removed all the excuses. He removed all the excuses for any organization that says, well, we kind of know we need to listen to what people need before we just go off and build something. Because we see that a lot, like, hey, we've decided we're going to have this program, but it's not really based on anything besides maybe external pressure to do something, right? But we haven't decided, or we haven't really gone through a process of listening to our organization, looking at the data, and then making sound data-driven decisions on how to move forward. And so what Rich has just done is he's removed all the excuses and the barriers to that. One of the things that I love, Rich, that you mentioned was about how every company has some sort of compliance training at the end of the year that is required for every employee. And so it takes nothing to then add into that several questions about diversity, equity, inclusion that are a requirement. It's a part of what you have to do. And we all know how this works in corporate. If you don't do it, then you get put on a list and it goes to your supervisor and there are consequences. So really at this point, that I'm so glad you shared that, because there are no excuses. Like we're fresh out of excuses as to why companies are not going forward and making sure that their leaders are making data-driven decisions. I think early on in this whole process, so maybe over the summer, there was a tendency to just be reactive, to just say, hey, I want to do something, so we're just going to do something. And that's fine, but it's the end of the year now and we're going into 2021. And so now you have an opportunity to not just be reactive, but to be proactive based on data. So Rich, I want you to hang around because we'll have some more conversation on this, but I do want to go to another poll question. And this is leading into our next guest, our next spotlight. But I want you to select the statement that best describes your organization, okay? And again, remember, we committed to tell the truth. So if you are answering B, like I see some people answering, that's fine. If it's the truth, then it's the truth. So A is there's strong leadership commitment, and we're well on our way to real action. Our leaders say they're committed, but I haven't seen much action. We have too much going on, because that's a real thing. So there are a lot of companies that said, hey, we're in the midst of a reorg, we're having layoffs, there's COVID-19, there's the remote workforce, there are all these things. So we can't address it. And then some say we really don't have a reason for a lack of action, except for leaders don't really want to change. So let's see. Wow, 58%. So it looks like the top percentage is that the leaders say that they're committed, but there hasn't been much action. And I think so far, we've already heard from Larissa, we've heard from Rich, that there are some things that leaders and organizations could be implementing in the midst of all the disruption of 2020. And so if you say you're committed, it is about walking the talk, which is an excellent segue into my next guest spotlight. Pranika Sinha. She is the Senior Manager in Talent Development and Inclusion at Occidental Petroleum. And Pranika is not just in this role recently. When I first met Pranika years ago, she was a leader on the National Diversity Council. So this is not a 2020 thing for her. This is something that she has lived for close to 2 decades. And Pranika is working with an organization and leading this effort. And when I say leading this effort, her team is responsible for the strategy and the execution at Occidental around inclusion. And so Pranika is going to share with us what they have done. And also, Pranika, I'd love to just start out with asking you about, you know, that part where, hey, the business is very disrupted, and talk about some of the things that have been happening at Oxy and how you all have still been able to make progress in this environment that has been extremely disrupted by economic downturn, by the commodity prices dropping in oil and gas, and just by COVID-19 disruption. So Pranika, welcome. And I can't wait to hear your responses on this.
Thanks, Janae. Hi, everyone. So for Oxy being in oil and gas, it's definitely a cyclical business. So things go up and down. We did make a large acquisition last year, so we were at a different point financially than other oil and gas companies. So that's something else to consider. And so we did have layoffs earlier this year in 2020 at the beginning of the year. Last year is when we formally added diversity and inclusion to my department. We dabbled in it for some time, but we actually made it a part of the department's name. But with COVID happening, we slowed down, and I told this to Janae earlier this week, we slowed down to basically like a zero budget, except for a couple of assessments. You know, we are going to shift all of our training to online over Microsoft Teams. We're going to try and lay out a diversity, inclusion, and belonging strategy, but not spend much money on it. And we have had to be creative. We've had to be resilient. We've had to involve many people outside of just our department, because we are a small, mighty team of 4 people, including me, for a 12,000 plus person company. So, you know, you can't underestimate the power of people with innovative ideas. And so what we have done is involve the business. You can't do everything from HR. You can't be everything to everyone from HR, and it's too much. So we have a diversity, inclusion, and belonging committee, and we have a number of people from the business who've gotten involved, and they have helped us make progress on this journey. We have a long way to go, but at least I can say that we are definitely making progress. And one of our committee leaders is actually within the audience today as well.
Very good. So Pranika, I asked you that question because I think although Oxy is in a unique situation, it's not unique across the board because we've seen so much economic downturn in 2020, and it could easily be a reason or excuse to say we can't prioritize this year, right?
Yeah.
So, but I love what you said about getting the business involved. And so what we know is that a lot of times diversity, equity, inclusion programs fail because they are wholly owned by HR.
Right.
And that there is no one from the business who is actually sponsoring it. There's no one with P&L control who actually has a stake in the outcomes. And so when you look at the data around diversity and inclusion programs, that is a point of failure for a lot of organizations.
Yes.
But somehow in this environment and with everything else, you have been able to bring the business side of Oxy along. So your organization sits in HR and you have the full support of HR. But I want you to talk a little bit more about how you did that. How did you bring the business into this to really have some ownership?
Sure. So I want to make one statement at the outset, and that is that alignment happens at the intersection of people and conversations. If you are not out talking to people about this outside of HR, nothing is going to happen. So I'm going to repeat that one more time.
Yes, please.
Alignment is the intersection of people and conversations. No matter if they're messy, they're uncomfortable, you're scared to have them, we have to have those conversations. So I will say that some of the most important conversations were with our CEO, Vicki Holland. She is a huge proponent of diversity and inclusion. You know, she would email me early on a Saturday morning and say, I don't understand why people don't get this statement that Black Lives Matter. You know, she'd send me memes. So when your CEO is emailing you, Veronica, we have to get people to understand this, then you know that it's important. But she went a step beyond that, just emailing me. She said, we need buy-in of our board of directors. We're a public company and our board of directors matters, especially coming off a year where we've had this acquisition. So in September, we made a presentation to our board of directors solely about diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Over Zoom, all the board of directors and our entire executive leadership team was on virtually over Zoom, and they were able to not only listen to the presentation, but also ask questions. There were a number of other presentations being done as well, but lo and behold, to our surprise, we became one of the darling presentations. So they were still talking about us days later. This is the first time that our CEO sent out a global email about diversity, inclusion, and belonging. But despite that, you have to repeat messages. It's a really emotional time and people's hearing gets clouded when it's emotional. So the more you repeat the message, the better. So she's talked about it in global town halls. And what we want to do now, and the day after the board meeting, she said, I want all of my direct reports to get in on this conversation. So to answer Janae's question, it's not just board of directors or just CEO. She said, we all have to be talking about this, and that starts with my direct reports. So one of the questions that I shared with Janae that we asked is, how will your business or function know that you support diversity, inclusion, and belonging? What will you say or do to let your people know that you support this? And we sat there with that question. I'm okay with silence, and so is she. And so we waited until people responded. I will say that one of the difficulties is, you know, people look at diversity and it's really facts and stats, and sometimes talking about that makes people uncomfortable. So of course we have inclusion, but I still felt like people were not listening. And so we actually shifted what we called it at Oxy, and we include the word belonging. Because when you include the word belonging, you're including everybody. And we want everyone to feel like they belong. And I felt like by adding that word, by talking about it, by defining it, we have been able to have more genuine conversations and have also more buy-in from people at all different levels.
So, Chronica, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that was going to be my next question to you. So, when you introduced this concept of belonging and really made it a core part of the work that you were doing, you know, going back to our conversation with Rich and talking about measurement and the importance of data and measurement, belonging is something that feels so squishy. Like, how would you measure that, right? And how do you know when your workforce feels like they belong? So could you talk a little bit about that, around some of the things that you all are doing to put some more metrics around belonging?
Right. So for those of you that don't know, belonging is really, well, it's a fundamental human need. You know, it's core to our DNA, but it's the emotional outcome that you want for everybody in your organization. You know, exclusion causes pain. When people feel like they don't belong, they're going to have lower job performance. There's going to be turnover. There's going to be more sick days. And so when people feel like they belong, that really results in a lot of savings for organizations. So obviously you can measure via surveys. You can do pulse surveys, you can do employee engagement surveys. So we have asked diversity and inclusion solely, the D&I questions on previous employee engagement surveys. What we have not asked about is belonging. So that is something that we are aspiring to. But what I want to make sure that we're talking about here is also leadership. So in performance management, we're now involving our Korn Ferry competencies when we talk about performance management, and employees and leaders are measured on those. So we tie our values to competencies. So how are you, quote unquote, committing to good, which is a value? We measure that by associating it with competencies, because you can see and hear behaviors being done. So you have to operationalize your values. They can't just be on your website or on a sheet of paper or on your badge. You have to operationalize those and be able to measure them. So we're doing that with our performance feedback. The second one is we are currently revising our 360 process to also include the competency of valuing differences for leaders. So when we measure the competency of being able to value differences as a leader, we know and can have their direct reports, their leaders, and their colleagues measure them or comment on how they're being inclusive. And then the last part is, you know, I look at this from a 5-point thing. So I'll say it, I know people are taking notes, so I'll say it slow, okay? So align. Why is, we call it DIBS. Why is DIBS important? And it can't just be me saying that, or a committee or a CEO, but people
and Veronica, I'm sorry, can you tell them what the DIBS acronym stands for?
Sorry.
Yeah.
It's so ingrained in my head now. I just
No, I love it. You were saying it like, oh, everyone knows DIBS.
Yeah, well, everybody used to probably call dibs on the front seat when they were younger. I used to fight with my sister, and so DIBS is basically this driving force for diversity, inclusion, and belonging. It is a force. When you call dibs on something, that is propelling you forward to get what you want. I did not come up with this. Pat Wadors, Wadors, she wrote this great article on diversity, inclusion, and belonging. You should go check it out. But we call it DIBS at Oxy. And so we have to be able to align by talking about why DIBS is important. So first one's align. The second one is listen, seek to understand. It still gives me chills, even though it's been months since we've done this, but having listening sessions in your workplace is so incredibly important to knowing what people's perspectives are. The first listening session that we did, I know many of us had to come off camera because we were so emotional. And this isn't, it's not Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. These are real people that you work with, and that is their reality. And people needed to hear that. So the second one is listen. You have to seek to understand. The third one is inform. So what's working and not working? And that's part of that alignment that I talked about with the conversations. You need to be not just asking for feedback, but also seeking advice from people. What is working and what is not working with this? And part of that is, for me, first was asking my Black colleagues, how are you today? Are you okay? The second part is what we're doing making a difference? Tell me what else we can do. I don't share the same perspective that you do. So we have to ask people, and we have to ask often. The fourth one is enable. So you've got to have a coaching culture. You've got to be able to coach teams and leaders about what DIBS really means and how it's going to propel the business forward. This isn't just a nice to do. Let's do it because it's the flavor of 2020. We have to actually show our leaders why this is important and then help them find inclusive language to be able to lead better. And then the last one is check in, and you got to check in often. So measure, course correct, celebrate, recognize, all of that matters. And so, we've been trying to celebrate small wins, but we've also we know we're going to make mistakes. And so you've got to be real that there's going to be messy chaos in this, and that we're going to be able to do better tomorrow when we know that we can course correct as well.
Veronica, thank you for, all of that. I've been seeing the chat and Q&A kind of go off as you've been talking. And so I know just taking notes on some of these steps, but what I appreciate about what you offered was that these are things that are actionable right now. Like you gave 5 points that I don't care what business you work with, I don't care what your role is in that organization, you can do something, you can take action from some of those 5 points, right?
Yes.
It wasn't anything super complex. Obviously, it's something that can be scaled, but I love that because what we're doing today is we're removing the excuses and the barriers. And so whoever showed up and said, hey, there are some things that we would do, but we can't, there's no can't, right? There's no you can't do. All of our panelists have given you some tools and tips that you can take back and start taking action immediately. So with that said, our next guest, last but not least, and Dustin, I'm going to throw you a curveball, so apologies in advance. So because we are, this conversation has been so rich, but we are running out of time to get like our other panelists in, and I see people with their hands up, and we got stuff in the Q&A, and we got stuff going on in chat. I'm going to start bringing people in. So when you see random people popping up on the screen, that's what's happening. Stephanie, do we have any questions that we need to address in Q&A before we go on to Dustin?
I think one is a fairly universal one. It says most people have a historic image of leadership as a male and white. So we look for those in our next choice of leader. How do we address that unconscious bias and truly value diversity?
Wow. So just to repeat that question, and I think everyone should be able to see it in the Q&A, but it is about this concept that a leader, particularly a corporate leader, is a white man. And so when you're selecting particularly a senior leader, that's kind of been the go-to. And so I think that's a good segue because Dustin is a white man, but also Dustin has a unique view in terms of just his position in Shell and some of the work that he's doing at Shell right now, but also just his personal journey. So I want to introduce formally Dustin Henry. And Dustin is new in his role, but Dustin has been on a journey, a personal journey, that his professional career has now caught up with it. So Dustin has extensive experience in oil and gas. He currently works for Shell, but has also worked for ExxonMobil and worked in different business units. But right now, his team actually is owning 2 of the key pillars at Shell around the U.S. Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program. And so Dustin is here with us. Dustin, I'm so glad to have you. But I'd love to hear you weigh in on this question that came in, right? So there's this concept that white men are leaders, and what do we do to address that bias? And then, of course, I've got a couple other questions for you too.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and I think what's so rich in the question in and of itself is it starts with an acknowledgement and awareness of the bias. And I think we all need to recognize that whether we are a white man, we still have and potentially have that same bias inherent in us. So I think it's a call to action, one, to check our own bias, right? As we have those discussions or those thoughts or those dreams. And I think the other bit for me is just what's so important. And it goes back to Larissa's point just around what an inclusive mindset is. And, for me, for example, I know there are very few times throughout my career where I have been the only, if you will, in a meeting or in a call or room, and meaning that I often in a meeting that I'm in, there's at least another male and there's at least another white person, if not multiple of them. Whereas the reality for a number of my colleagues, right, whether they are female, whether they are Black, Asian, whatever it may be, are often the only. And so what I am trying to reflect on and say is, how do I lead then, and how do I show up to recognize that even though I may not share that same gender or ethnic group, that the only is no longer something that enters their mind because they know they have an ally when they step into the room before that meeting or before the call. And it's great that I'm on that personal journey, but that's not going to, I'm not that important, so we're not going to change the world if it's just me, right? And so it's how do we start to build that mindset and that call to action and the challenge to those white men who are leaders, and for them to recognize that they have a vital role in this conversation. In fact, if they don't change, nothing is going to change, and we
Right.
can't let nothing change. Sorry.
Thank you so much for that. I
Yeah.
no, I love it. I love it. I love anytime I talk to you and anytime we're having these discussions and kind of, even just, doing some collective problem solving, the passion around that is always there. So Dustin, I want to ask you about this topic of intervention, right? It's something that we know very much about in terms of safety, right? We see something happening unsafe in an organization, particularly in your industry in oil and gas, there are very specific, if someone is working unsafely, if someone is doing something that is putting themselves or others in danger, there is not only an expectation, but really a requirement for others to call it out. How do we get from there for safety, but have the same thing happen and have those same interventions happen when someone is doing something that is explicit bias, implicit bias, discrimination, telling a bad joke about a certain race or gender? Like, how do we get our organizations to that point where they can intervene? And if you could talk about some of the things maybe you're thinking about it, Shell, around that topic.
Yeah, fantastic question and parallel, right? Because if we reflect on why we're comfortable in intervening from a safety perspective, it's because we are not willing to accept the consequences when there's an issue, right? Because the consequences mean that someone is hurt, that there's some impact to the environment, or yeah, someone's family and livelihood is impacted. We are not willing to accept the consequences of failure from a safety perspective. And so I draw that parallel because it should be no different when we're talking about matters of humanity or matters of the heart, right? So if we think of this space in particular, we have to be absolutely and fundamentally clear that we're not willing to accept the consequences of inaction here. And there's really two things that have just catalyzed me personally. One is just this live quote, and that I hope to share with my son at some point. He's 2 years old, but it's a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. And it's not the words of my enemies, but it's the silence of my friends that I will remember. And I have far too many friends to hear me or not hear me, right? To not hear me speak up and intervene. And so I have no choice but to speak up because of those friends. And then just from in the corporate setting and philosophical, one article that I often frequently use is an HBR article. It's a study by the University of Colorado, and it was written in 2016, and it was entitled "Women and Minorities Are Penalized for Promoting Diversity." And so why I share that article is because, again, to me, this is about appealing to and helping folks realize that there is a critical role for white men, white women to be involved in and lead in this conversation as well, right? And so for me, it's helping them connect with, on a personal level, but also a scientific level in terms of the studies here that there is a role to play. And so we all must intervene, right? Because the behaviors that we choose to accept are the behaviors that we, rather the behaviors that we tolerate are the ones that we accept, right? And that is a message that we can't have the organization see nor feel when we're absolutely clear that DE&I, it's not a priority, it's a value. And why I draw that distinction is because it's easy to reprioritize or deprioritize, but we can't devalue, right? And so that's why a fundamental core value at Shell and what has to be a fundamental expectation of leadership is a DE&I. It's the inclusive mindset that Larissa shared, is some of the commitment conversations and elements that Pranika shared. It's all of those things.
So Dustin, thank you so much for sharing that. I have one more thing that I'd love for you to touch on. And then as you all can see, we have new panelists joining us because this is what we do at Bold X Brave. So Diane, welcome. Samantha, welcome. And then if you want to be a panelist, it might be too late because we're running out of time, but you can raise your hand to also come on camera and just have a conversation with our other guests. So Dustin, similar question that I posed to Pranika, but I think a little bit different just because of the nature of the organization. So your team has been tasked with really doing some implementation of the plans that have been laid out by senior leadership for Shell US. And you literally own a pillar of that, right? So how do you work with your senior leaders in getting them to stay committed? So it's easy to kind of just lay out a plan and then just say, hey, you all go do it. Go fix it. Go make it right. So what do you do to really have that conversation with your senior leaders to help them understand that this is not our plan. This is the collective our plan. This is all of us. And it includes you, senior leader.
Yeah, I think it requires a fundamental commitment conversation. And I hate to throw out another quote there, but it's one from Ken Blanchard, and there's a difference between interest and commitment. When you're interested in something, you only do it when it's convenient. When you're committed to something, you accept no excuses, only results. Ooh. And quite frankly, if we as an organization put out a plan, then we are saying and stating both internally and externally that this is a commitment. And so we've already made that commitment. And so there is no alternative but to accept results. And as important as I think our function is and the role that we play, the reality is we don't lead the organization as a whole. We're not the senior leaders. We're not the folks that teams affiliate with. That's just not and never going to be, nor should it be, our role. Where folks will see leadership is from within their lines. And it comes down to the senior leaders, but also that individual line manager, right? If I reflect on the experience, it's often the line manager at the refinery that has the team of 10 operators. That's where the experience and the tolerance of behavior and really credibility of our plan is met, right? Is at that point, because again, this is such an individual and organizational matter. We have to address both levels of leadership.
Excellent. I hope you all were taking notes. I'm still seeing some activity in the chat. Diane and Samantha, thank you so much for being our guest panelists. Now, I do have to do a time check. We have like 20 minutes. We got to go quickly because we got like a little bit more content, and I do want to honor everyone's time. But this conversation has been so rich, and I'm really I want to thank my 4 special guests. So Rich, Larissa, Pranika, Dustin, thank you for being here with me today. And I want to open it up to our new panelists. So Diane, if you don't mind, I'll start with you. I see you're already unmuted and ready to talk. So okay. Diane, do you have a question or do you have a comment, or tell me why you're here? Let's talk to the audience.
I worked for Emerson. I'm a business unit leader at Emerson. I'm changing job, but I've been in manufacturing, oil and gas, and engineering for 20 years, right? So and like what Dustin said, typically I have been experienced that I'm the only woman engineering in the room, or I'm only a woman leader in executive rooms. So, and then I lead our Women in STEM group. So I absolutely echo what Dustin just said. That article is I was advised actually say, do not make, you made it so far, do not make women in STEM your brand, because that could hurt you, right? Because you could take it seriously, right? So I actually was seriously advised on that. So you want to make sure, if you want people to take it seriously, you don't want that be your brand. So that was very interesting. And I want to thank all the panelists, because I learned, I joined because I want to learn, and I almost wrote down nuggets from every single one. And then especially what Larissa said earlier, put your emotion on the shelf. That was very, that's really new, and I resonate with that. Absolutely. So thank you. And yeah, so I actually wrote down, so I want to thank you for that. So
Diane, thank you so much. And thank you for participating and being a part of this, and also just, you know, being bold and brave enough to come on camera and show your face and to add your comments to the session. So Samantha, I want to go to you. So Samantha, I've been seeing your name all in chat this entire time, so it's not shocking to me that you're one of our panelists. But Samantha, tell us about what you do, and what's your question or your comment?
So I work for Shell. I've had the fortune of traveling across the globe, and I really, really value different people's point of view, different personality profiles, and really hearing and getting everybody included in the conversation. So I'm really passionate in and around creating inclusive environments and listening. And that's part of the reason I'm here. The other part is I don't understand what it's like here in the United States to be Black and to face some of the significant prejudice that comes when I can't hide that I'm a woman. So people are going to judge me for that. But my colleagues can't hide the colour of their skin either. And that means they potentially face barriers that I don't face. And I want to understand that. So that's kind of why I'm in the room, is to further understand and be able to be more inclusive and recognize when other people are being exclusive. And I did ask the question about unconscious bias, because for me, that's the tricky bit. I look at our organisation and our choices of EVP and VP recently, and I went, I'm not really seeing us live what I know is happening behind the scenes. I know behind the scenes we've done an amazing job interacting and connecting with our staff members to understand where they're at, and have a really good program. Maybe not happening quite as fast as everybody wants, but we do have that. And then I look at the choices and I'm going, that's not as many women and not as diverse as I hoped. And so I want to understand what other organisations are doing to get the rubber to hit the road and actually make that change. And sure, we can't, if we've got a disparity between where people are now and where we aspire them to be, we can't yank everybody up. That doesn't work. We need to put programs in place to get them there, but I want to hear how others are doing that.
So I'll defer that question to one of our panelists, that particularly Chronicle or Larissa, to help answer that question. And Samantha, I appreciate that you are calling it out, because I think there's a call out in that. There's, hey, we've seen all this activity and all of this, you know, focus around what the company says that they want to be and where they're going. But then they have this critical moment where they can make a different decision. The decision seems to be about the same as what they've been making. And so I appreciate your courage for just calling that out. It's especially, I mean, I know some of your colleagues, Rochelle, are in this meeting too. So thank you for doing that. But I'd love to hear from Chronica or Larissa to address that question.
Sure, I'm happy to share. So, you know, if we really want to shift culture and we want to promote belonging, we are redoing our onboarding, not only to make it amenable to virtual. So if people come on board, they can do that virtually, We revamped our mentoring or buddy programs. So we're still assigning a mentor and also a peer advisor. People need to have a friend at work, community. And then training. So if we really want to shift culture, we are doing training about psychological safety, unconscious bias, microaggressions. Shout out to my microaggressions facilitator, Michael, who's on right now. And then one that we haven't tackled yet that we think will be huge in shifting culture is privilege. So we're tackling the first three right now. So psychological safety, unconscious bias, and microaggressions, and then hopefully down the line, privilege. And what we've also done is embedded inclusive leadership training in our leadership programs. So we're talking about it in our emerging leaders series, we're talking about it in our frontline leadership program, and we're going back to people who've been through our highest level to retroactively put them through it because they need to be able to lead inclusively.
Thank you.
Excellent, Veronica. Any of the other panelists have anything to add to that? And Dustin, feel free to chime in too, since you do work in Shell. So there might be, you may have some perspective too for us, Amanda.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think one that all of us should seriously reflect on in terms of, when we, our actions have to meet, what we say as well, right? And so I think for me, it's one that we should always continue to bring a healthy bit of skepticism, because that's how you get progress, right? And that's why I love the bold conversation concept, because, and it's a quote by Robin DiAngelo, being nice isn't going to solve racism. And so we need to engage in uncomfortable conversation because that's the root of growth. That's the root of learning. And one thing that we have recently begun talking about in detail in Shell is this learner mindset. And so how do you bring a humble curiosity to learn from others and someone that's not like yourself without any preconceived answer or notion of what you're looking for? And so again, the proof will be in the pudding, if you will, in terms of as this work continues, but we have to ask the questions and we have to engage in the conversations that we haven't historically, because that's then and only how we'll get to a different place than where we've been.
I think that I agree with everything everyone just said. I think mine would just be some mindset things, Amanda, of push leaders to stop admiring the problem. I think that's a cultural, it's a passive resistance thing to just talk about it, because I really think we could take more action if we just said by end of year, we're going to do this. Hold people's feet to the fire on cultural shift, not taking multi-year. It's stop all that. That's just a passive resistance way. If you hold people accountable, you can get action better. And the other thing I would tell you is start calling out the behaviors that are detrimental to the culture. We talk about culture like it's fairy dust. And culture is truly the silent CEO. I tell people culture is the true CEO. So if you want it to happen, the culture will tell you if it's going to or not. But people have to start calling out the things that are detrimental in the culture so that we can align plans and actions to change them. So some of the things that Veronica touched on, I love the plan because that's an actionable mindset behavior shift plan that she's talking about rolling out. And that is culture. Culture is behavior. If everybody shows up at 8, or do you show up at 7:50 and nobody said that? It's behavior. So if the plan isn't rooted in behavior, then you're not really addressing the culture.
Wow. So I want to I hope everyone is soaking this part in, because again, we have removed excuses. We've removed barriers. No one can leave here and say, well, I'm not sure what I can do. You may not have the entire plan together, right? That's not the point. But the point is there's got to be something that you can take away from all of this discussion that we've had. And even if it's just, as Larissa mentioned, about the mindset shift, even if it is about, okay, we know that we need to make better data-driven decisions. And so Rich has given us some things about that we need to do, even if we don't have the infrastructure to do it, even if we don't have the resources to do it. Veronica has given you 5, here are the 5 things, right? Write that down, Take it back to your team, take it back to your leadership. Dustin is full of quotes. Like, I love talking to Dustin because Dustin has those quotes that kind of just linger with you. But he's also talking about like, hey, this is what you need to do to get your senior leadership on board. This is how you get buy-in. He's also talking about, and this is something that we've heard a lot when we've been engaging with clients. You know, people have said, hey, I'm not Black. So who am I to speak up? Who am I to say anything? Who am I to do anything about it? But Dustin just told us that he doesn't want to be that silent friend that's in the MLK quote. So there is something that everyone can do at this point. So I know that I'm getting like so many messages in chat. Stephanie, what have I missed before we go into our wrap up?
So I think the most important thing that I've seen, and it kind of covers several questions, is how do we hold people accountable and willing to implement consequences when leadership is concerned about the effects of those consequences?
Wow. How do you hold people accountable? So what I'll share with you on that, and then I definitely want one of our guests to weigh in on that. One of the things that we work on with our clients is this notion of moving from awareness to action to accountability. And it's a progression, right? Because we first have to level set and kind of get some baselines in place, get a common understanding, even just of the words, right? It may seem very elementary, but we have to get a common understanding, like, what is racism? What is systemic racism? What is racial equity? What's the difference between equity and equality? Like, really getting clear about that. And then let's look at this overall enterprise plan and say, okay, as an individual team, how are we going to adopt that? What parts of this are we going to make real in our business? And then how are we going to measure it, right? So how are we going to measure it? But you notice there's a we in all of that. So we are crowdsourcing solutions with individual teams within a broader organization, so that at the end of that, in the accountability phase, they have decided collectively, this is what we will do, this is what's in our action plan, and this is what we will measure, and this is how we're going to measure it. So like for one of our clients, we are building a Power BI dashboard based on what they've said they are going to measure, right? So there is actually a measurement tool that's in place that they can look at today, they can look at a year from now. Did we actually meet our goals, right? So there are some things that you can definitely do around that accountability, but there has to be leadership commitment in all of that. So we couldn't do that work with our client without that leader being committed to doing that work. And I think we have time for like one more person to chime in on that around the accountability.
I guess my question would just be, what are you afraid of when you hold people accountable, right? And isn't that a powerful thing to say, you know what, we're going to hold people accountable, and yes, there will be consequence, and guess what, that's a dang good consequence for the organization to see.
Yeah.
So what are you afraid of?
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead, Larissa.
I would just say accountability, often because we aren't the folks that need to be held accountable. It's a senior leader above you. So the person's asking for how I hold the higher ups. Tell them if you don't do anything, we'll repeat it. It's compound interest. You either earn it or pay it.
I would also then throw in that, kind of like what Larissa said, the accountability is at the higher levels above, and they will eventually get it when their pockets are impacted. Let's take the Wells Fargo example. Those 7 women that left, they now have to replace them. They now have to have training. They now have to catch them up. So if these are all powerful executive women who have known the business inside and out, the back of their hand of Wells Fargo, how long does it take a new person? How long is that training? How much money do they miss out on? And trust me, when you say how much money do they miss out on, they already know those statistics. So let's get those preventative statistics in there so that it doesn't come to that point.
And no one counts the marketing and brand damage campaign that has to go on for.
Yes.
Ooh.
Which I know you all know a little bit about that. So we are 5 minutes from closing. I'm going to share my screen one more time just to talk about what's next. But before we end, I just want to really thank my guests, because you have made this conversation so rich. The thing about it is, can I do this on my own? Maybe, but would I ever want to? Absolutely not. And so I'm clear that the work that we're doing requires collaboration. I've worked closely with most of you, and have some opportunities to work with some of you in the future. And I'm just excited about what you're doing and excited about your willingness to share it with other people, right? Like just to not keep it to yourself, because the same challenges that you're facing at work every single day, the people who are in this meeting right now, they're also facing those challenges. So with that said, I want to just wrap up today by sharing with you a couple of things that are coming next for next year, and also with a challenge. So there are two things that I want to focus on here, and one is about big courage. Now, if you heard from all of our special guests, they all talked about courage in one way or another. But at the root of all of this, everyone has to make that personal decision. So we can talk about the organization, we can talk about leadership. There were some questions today where there were some indictments on your company's leadership, right? And it's not to say that it's not true, but you have to ask yourself, what is my big courageous step? Who have I not spoken up for in my organization? Who could I be sponsoring that maybe I haven't sponsored? Who could I listen to? What can I actually do? And I think the wonderful thing about all of our guests is that each one of them gave you something that was actionable. There was nothing that was just theoretical, right? So again, we've removed the excuses and we've removed the barriers. And I'm asking you, I'm calling on you all to embrace your big courage. And then finally, we do have a Bold X Brave Masterclass. So if this was good and you're like, okay, I need more of this. And for some of you, this is your first time joining us in Bold X Brave. I invite you to join our masterclass. Right now, it is $97. It is happening on January 20th at 5 p.m., but it will be recorded. And some of the things that we're going to do are similar to what we've done in this session. But in this masterclass, this is where you are going to walk away with actual things to take back. So we're sharing actual real client case studies of things that we've seen work over the year in 2020 that you can take into 2021. And this is particularly for those who are saying, hey, I'm not in a position to make a decision to bring on a firm to kind of help us with this globally, but I do take personal responsibility and I do want to do something right now. So you should see the link in chat, but if you go to blueprint.boldxbrave.com, that's how you register. You'll also receive an email with more details after the session. But if you are interested, I encourage you to take advantage today. The pricing does change after December 15th. But our masterclass is a way for us to do a lot more of this, but in a smaller setting. And if you know me, you know you're coming to work. We're coming to get results. And I want you to take away something that you can actually have some impact back in your organization. So I really want to thank all of the people who are a part of this today. I really want to specifically thank our guests, but also to thank Exo Claveria, who is my executive assistant and who's been supporting in the background. I want to thank Stephanie Trevino, who is just, she's just a utility player on my team. Like she's just always ready to support in any way. And she's been the one that's kind of monitoring our Q&A and chat. And then of course, I want to thank all of our special guests. So in closing, I have one last question for you. What's the one big courage action you will take? And notice we have some measurements in Q1 of 2020, not just what's the thing that you're going to do eventually, but when January starts and you return back to work, what is your one big courage? And this should be a stretch. This should be something that, oh, I've been thinking about doing this, but I haven't done it. But what's your one big courage action? And it could be speaking up. It could be having that conversation with a leader that you know needs to happen. It could be advocating for someone else. It could be any of those things. So if you have already joined the poll, you should still be in the poll. And you can respond either by text message or you can respond by the link. Oh, I like it. Somebody said they're going to ask the CEO and the head of DEI what we've accomplished so far. Go big. I love it. Please go big. Contract explicitly with others who may be the only one. Good. This is one I want you to think about. So we'll leave it up. Check my biases and be more courageous. Continuing to push for change and advocating for others with a smaller voice. Call out microaggressions from Karens. Ooh, love it. These are big courage actions. So these are the things that are really going to move the needle. Because if you listen to all of the recommended steps and all of the things that our guests have shared today, they all require courage. Run corporate sessions on bystander intervention, regardless of buy-in. I love it. Yeah, we were going to talk about the bystander effect today, but we ran out of time. So thank you all for being a part of this the session today. This is the culmination. This is our 5th session. And mind you, when we started this, I can honestly say that I did not know what the outcomes were going to be when we started this session in June. And so just to see the evolution of it and to see how we've been able to have such an impact on people, and a lot of people that we don't even know, right? These are not, I didn't get a group of my friends together and say, hey, let's do a webinar. There are a lot of people who have joined our sessions that I had no connection to, but they all had the same goal and the same challenges and the same frustration that I did. And so I'm just so grateful that we're here today. I'm so grateful that we still have people who want to talk about this. And I'm even more grateful that there are people like my guests and others who are actually moving change forward in their organizations. So with that said, I'm not going to hold you any longer. Please make sure you reach out if you need help, if you need support. Look in your inbox for more information on our masterclass that's coming up in January. And if you just want to continue the conversation, this always happens where someone will inbox me on LinkedIn or they'll email me afterwards and say, I wanted to say something, but can we talk? Absolutely. I'm always happy to have the conversation. Guests, thank you so much. Dustin, Larissa, Stephanie, Pronica, Diane, Samantha, thank you so much. Thank you, Rich.
Thank you, Janae. Without you, this wouldn't have happened. Thank you.
I love the clap, Samantha. Have a good one, everyone.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Bye.
Bye.